In this season, we strive to bring you stories that decenter history.
History resonates differently with different people. Through sharing these personal stories, both from our guests and the people they talk about,
we want to challenge the dominant narratives that focus on single strands and one-dimensional stories.
Join us for Season 2 of Who This Podcast.
Season 2 is here to redefine the way we understand our past.
Because the past really happened, and history is just what somebody wrote down.
I'm Alma Aguilar. I am a trans woman and human rights defender from Aviala, Colombia. And today I'm gonna be talking about another amazing activist who stood up against all form of oppressions and outlasted a dictatorship, looking like a fabulous loca in stilettos. Pedro Lemebel, born Pedro II Mardones Lemebel, was born on November 21st, 1952 in El Sajón de la Guada, an impoverished neighborhood in Santiago de Chile. Later in life, he adopted his mother's surname Lemebel only as a gesture of allyship with femininity in his life and as a statement from his position of illegal homosexuality and transvestite. Lemebel was born in a context of extreme poverty during a time where being who he was deeply persecuted, not only by the state, but by society as a whole. All of these issues sort of that transversed his life were little by little making him become interested in speaking up about the realities that he saw growing up in a context where his neighbors, himself, struggled to survive with the least, to find food to eat every day, to be able to have access to any kind of services, being water, being access to education, for instance. I remember that one of the things Pedro Lemebel mentioned once in an interview that marked his life a lot and that made him realize the context in which he was living was waking up in the place where he lived and finding 3 dead bodies in front of his house. His neighbors were all also sort of there seeing what was happening, and the sort of history that was surrounded these 3 bodies was that the regime killed them because they were bad people, they were robbers, they were part of the opposition. But what Pedro saw were just 3 bodies of men that looked like all of his neighbors, that looked like a 50-year-old man who could have just come from the store to see his family. And that really marked him, because then he really also understood that the way in which he was living through this regime and through poverty was something that was also marking the narratives around what was sort of socially accepted, whose deaths were important and whose were not as important because they could be labeled as bad people, as robbers, as whoever else. And I think that was one of the first sort of moments that made him realize that speaking about this context was important.
What was the situation in which something like this could have happened? That there was 3 dead bodies in front of his house? Like, what was the political situation at the time that caused this to happen? As we know, like, Pinochet came into power, I want to say illegally, but through a coup, right? After overthrowing the democratically elected Allende, right? What was his way of governing that caused kind of this thing to be acceptable?
This all happened during the 70s after, as you mentioned, Augusto Pinochet led the coup that killed Allende. And all of this sort of established a collective consciousness around the kind of life that the people there were going to be facing for the next generations. With this, I mean that the regime, who again came from a very conservative agenda that aimed to establish a very particular economic system, deemed everyone who did not respond to those interests as unwanted. And in that sense, these 3 bodies come to play, right? These are 3 people living also at the margins of Santiago de Chile who are themselves very impoverished, who just appear in a very poor neighborhood where Pedro Lemebel happened to live. Pedro, by that time, realized queer person who was starting to grasp in many ways what he needed to do through his writings, through his life, through his performance was important because he was speaking about these realities, how it affected people from everyday life.
Yeah, what I find fascinating about this gruesome moment is that, let's say before this point, Pedro, he was part of a smaller group that was marginalized as a queer person, right? And then through the implementation of the dictatorship and then through these clear threats to everyone around him, because the bodies, they weren't just threats to, don't steal. They were threats to everyone because it was, you don't know, what we know about you, or we could say anything we want about you and this could be you, So it was it was truly an oppressive tactic. And then suddenly his experience as a person that dealt with marginalization for, I think I can safely assume, longer than many other people. He now had more experience in that way as a voice of marginalization. Because, as you said, he really started speaking about not just queer issues, but also the issues of everyone around him, of poverty in Chile, of everyone who was not part of the system and was therefore oppressed and left out and scared. And yeah, I just found it a very ironic, gruesome moment in that sense.
Yeah, and the fact of bodies, though, the whole idea of him seeing those bodies as other than the system, and because of that, the system sacrificed them, and probably understanding himself and his own body as a queer person, as a body that's other than the system, and probably was worthy according to the eyes of the system of being sacrificed, right? To uphold the system. And so how was he going to present his body? He wasn't going to allow them to use the body as they would want to use it. He decided to take charge of that body and decided to be bold with that body and stepped out in there looking at the sacrifices that was with these three bodies in front of him, and then decided to my body. And the whole idea of body in intersectional thought is a strong thing, because bodies then become the representation of the embodiment of a movement and the embodiment of a people's, right? And so him saying, my body is going to be one that I take charge of, and that they are not going to sacrifice it, I'm going to sacrifice it, and I'm going to do so boldly. It's an amazing move.
I think for him, it was also a reiteration that this could be him, this could be his loved ones. And particularly for a queer person at that moment, it was very important to come to that realization for what it meant for his safety, but also what it meant for the world that he was inhabiting, what kind of freedom he could expect if people who were just everyday life people, like ordinary people, were just showing up dead in front of his house. What could a queer person in Chile back then expect in terms of surviving a regime? I think that's why Pedro himself decided after that, to embody the class struggle, to embody the queer struggle, to embody sex worker struggle, all of these different identities that are marginalized, that were sort of at the forefront also of the different persecutions that were happening at the moment. He felt in many ways that he had to embody them, that he had to live them, that he had to set them free in the middle of a regime.
And so how did he do that? What did his art look like? In what way did he translate that?
Pedro was an artist. He studied to be an artist in the 70s, but most of his work was performative and writing. He was an amazing poet, but mostly a chronist, because he decided that writing novels were not really fair when so much was going on around him. So he decided to write more about the things that were happening around him and how it affected not only him, but the different peoples that were living in Chile at the moment.
Do you know this? Because I know that around this time he tried to be a teacher, and then he was, fired for being queer. Do you know if this is around the same moment or if he's already, let's say, become marginalized at this moment? Do you know like the time frame of what's happening right now a little bit?
Yeah, so this was in the 70s when he decided to study to become an arts professor. But after he graduated, he found himself not being able to find any job because he was presenting himself as an openly homosexual man back then. And even at this point, before all of his activism, by just existing, he was already presenting a statement. So this was sort of the early Pedro in the 70s that was trying to make it as a teacher, but then realized there's no way he could have made it as a teacher if he didn't have this other fight, because nobody would be able to give him a job, give him a security, unless he would be able to sort of bring this awareness that was needed.
And so what did his statements look like then?
The first statements that he did as part of the duo Las Yeguas del Apocalipsis were in company of one of his closest friends. They would storm political and cultural events, basically, to present their opposition, not only to the regime, but also to sort of the leftist, Marxist groups that were presenting an alternative to the regime at the moment, because they themselves were also discriminating against queer people. They were not really including them in their struggle for liberation against this regime. Pedro would call out this through his performances. He would just show up whenever politicals would come together to try to raise awareness about this. He would come in drag, for instance. He would come with his heels, with his long heels, just trying to present through his body the dissidence that he was living.
What did that criticizing look like?
So he himself, he was in many ways aligned with communism. He had a lot of expectations from it, but then he resented also, and he called out this hypocrisy of not actually being a different way of surviving or of creating society for not only queer people, but also women, for instance. So the way he which criticized this was, again, through these performances, but also through his writing. He would question a lot of these political persons that would embody the leftist sort of ideals to basically let them know what kind of manhood are you building. They were basically also creating this notion of what the communist man should be, right? And with that, a notion of what manhood should look like. So he would question that. What is the manhood that you're creating when my manhood, for instance, was given to me by the night, was basically pushed into me by the violence that I've been facing my whole life. So how is this manhood not being recognized in whatever sort of system that you want to establish? So he was also very critical of the quote-unquote democracy that at that moment, during the late 70s and 80s, was being thought of by the leftist government. During the early 80s, he created this group that I was talking about called Las Yeguas del Apocalipsis. This was actually a play of association between the AIDS movement, or the AIDS is a disease that was seen as a plague that was brought about by the apocalypse, and the word yeguas, mares, that was used to sexualize women. And just the creation of this group in itself was a big statement against, all of these different systems, not only the regime that were oppressing queer women and all of these different communities. Through this work, what I found really interesting is that Lemebel gave birth to the counterculture in Chile. He, in many ways, made possible to have these types of statements, these types of representation. It was very funny because at that moment, when people heard of Las Yeguas del Apocalipsis, there was a lot of media talking about how awful it was to have these queer people presenting in the streets and how they needed to be eradicated, basically. And people had this idea that it was a big group when it was only two people that were, with whatever they had, trying to create a consciousness of this is the real Chile. This is what is going on whenever you close your doors at night, people are still living, people are still suffering, people are poor, people are queer, we are here and we live of this. So what can we do to make us visible? What can you do also to include us in whatever new way that you're trying to establish that breaks this regime?
But it's multiple layers of marginalization for Pedro, right? Because he also came from a very poor family. So it's he brings in the different layers. So it's not only the queerness that is very important in his, at least what I read in his criticism, also the fact that a lot of people are suffering because they're very poor, right? He came from a super poor background, and he brings in the multi layers of marginalization in the art and the stories that he creates.
Yes, indeed. I think in everything he did, he spoke of his experience with poverty, even in his activism as a queer person. There's a reason why I don't call him gay. He used to say himself that he didn't like to be called gay. He actually called himself fag. He found the term gay to be derogatory because for him, that was the rich homosexuals, basically. And it didn't really speak of what queer people look like in a poor Chile. So he reclaimed the terms such as queer and faggot, or how he would call himself loca, or queen, or a faggot, because that depicted the raw reality of what it meant to be a queer person back then. And I think that spoke a lot of that class struggle, because he also posed a lot to the LGBTI struggle when it became sort of a more mainstream thing, because he was also saying this LGBTI struggle is a way to sort of commodify our struggles and take away that what makes us us, is a way to normalize us in a society that is just looking for new ways to eradicate us through this normalization.
You know what is so funny to me is like, he was not just standing up for like the queer community or the LGBTQI community, right? He was standing up for everything that's marginalized. Femininity, queerness, poverty, and just the normalcy of people, like the everyday life of people, which was also marginalized within this political context. And his whole life was dedicated to kind of like disrupting that normalcy, the normalcy of this hegemonic, male-centered, heteronormative, rich, aristocratic type of living, right? And his whole body, his art, and this is what I love about his art. His art is not just words he put on the paper, but his art was like, he was fully performative, right? Fully performative in his living, fully performative in his disruption, fully performative in his writing, in his interviews. He was just living, and as I like to say, the embodied or the incarnated version of a disruption into normalcy.
Indeed, later in life, also after the regime was brought down and democracy was reestablished, even though criminalization of LGBT people still remained until 1999, he would present himself, as you say, in a very performative way. He would always walk or storm everywhere with heels. And a lot of his friends would always ask him, why, Pedro? Like, doesn't that hurt you? He would always reply, yes, but this is my place of enunciation. I need to show them I'm here. I need to show them there's people like me. And I found that truly emancipating for a person at that time to be able, with all of these different challenges, to just show himself as he was.
Right. And it's also about lasting out, like he outlasted the regime. Like he was fully tenacious. Like it was showing himself, but also making sure that he endured. And I think that was ultimately, what inspired, I think, the inspiration reaches beyond, because it's just, it's tenacious and it's inspiring to see like he outlasted the regime.
He understood the regime he was fighting against as extreme.
Yeah.
Right. And even though he was like, okay, like I'm not going to wear heels every day, but every time I step out into that space in the public space, I am going to put on my heels and I'm going to become the extreme resistance against this extremeness of this government that is doing this to, as I said, to femininity, to poor, to the queer, to everyone, right? So he understood himself as having to stand in the extreme opposite, even so extreme that even the left was not extreme enough. He had to go far left of the left and become the most extreme, again, in his incarnated reality.
So question then, after the dictatorships were over, what did his art become when democracies and more liberal thinking took its way into Chile? I think in the 90s, right?
The end of the dictatorship was 89, and again, through 89 to 99, there was decriminalization. So a lot of his work during the regime was very sporadic. There was no agenda. He would just come and do things. And if you were not there, you would sort of miss it. After that, there was more of an appreciation of how he stood up for queer people during the regime, but also a lot more about the writings, a lot more about the chronicles of the people that were, even after the regime was over, still suffering from the same things that they were suffering during the regime. And I think he understood also, as a lot of queer people at that time, that even though the regime was awful, there were a lot of killings, a lot of disappearances, queer people were persecuted even before the regime. So there was still a lot of things to be done. And he worked focused on that, on capturing all those stories that remain at the margins of society. And he even had a radio show in the late 90s where he told some of the chronicles of the stories that he had written over the years, and he was quite successful. He always knew how to capture people's attention, not only through his performances and his life, but through his most important gun, I would say, his most important power, which was his words, everything he wrote, but everything he spoke as well.
I want to bring you into the conversation a little bit, because before you weren't going to do him, right? But you're just speaking of this being something that happened even before the Pinochet came into power. And you were looking for something else. You were looking for queerness before all this. But you were saying that it was hard to find. What led you to then say, first of all, what was it were you going to do before? And then what led you to this position of picking Pedro?
I think I chose Pedro because of how he spoke of intersectionality. Again, how he stood up against an authoritarian regime for the emancipation of not only queer people, but of a lot of groups that were turned vulnerable and invisible at that time. But indeed, I was not really looking to present his story originally, because I really wanted to talk about how queerness existed in the continent, in Abya Yala or Latin America, before colonization. Unfortunately, and I know Pedro knew this very well because he grew up amongst Mapuches, indigenous communities in Chile. Our indigenous communities have oral traditions. So a lot of the stories are passed generation from generation, and there are not really writings. So it's really hard to find anything that speaks about queerness, because when the colonizers came, the way in which they eradicated us was through normalizing us, right? Through erasing us. So they wanted to turn everything that was sort of out of their normal, just out of the whole picture. And in that sense, it was just impossible to find something. Even though I myself, I'm an advocate, have been supporting indigenous queer organizing for a while, the stories that are known are very present but very scattered, also because of that lack of recognition and because of that harm to the history of our peoples before colonization.
Maybe then a final question. What do you think the story of Pedro tells people? What do you think people should take away from that story?
I think for me, the main takeaway of Pedro was his stand on emancipation as a community thing instead of an individual thing. He didn't really speak for his freedom. He didn't really speak for his emancipation, even though he was living all of that through his own body. He really spoke about how we're not truly free until all of us are free. And that is what I find beautiful and powerful of his life and his work. I think Pedro's gift to the world was letting us know that this could happen even at the worst of times, because he did it when no one else was able to stand up against a dictator in the same way that he did. So he was a real man, a real fag man wearing heels.
How did and just to top it off, how did he pass, and what was that like? Were you around when? Did you remember him passing?
I was sort of little when that happened.
Okay.
Well, not little, but yeah, I was still in high school when Pedro Lemebel passed away. It was 2015, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, 20.
There were a lot of commemorations for his life. He was doing a theater play, basically, on one of his main pieces of work. And he got cancer. He got throat cancer, which in his word was sort of not funny, but weird, because all of his life he was also fighting AIDS and HIV and creating all this stigma. And what brought him down in the end was cancer. But it was also very beautiful because in his last days, even though he lost his most precious power, which was his voice, he was able to be present at that play of his work against all medical advice. He just showed up there, and then he was able to receive the appreciation of not only those queer lives that he touched through his life, but of everyone else that now knew how queer people could do amazing things because of just how incredible he lived his life. All of those who were present at that play and all of those who would come also later on to that play will realize how impactful Pedro's life and work was.
Beautiful.
My manhood wasn't given to me by a political party because they rejected me with laughter many times. My manhood was to bear the mockery, eating my own rage in order not to kill everyone. My manhood is to accept myself as different. Being a coward is much harder. I don't turn the other cheek. Instead, I give my ass, comrade. Thank you everyone for listening today. Find us wherever you find your favorite podcasts, and see you next time.